Hey, what's up guys? Gons here for the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel. I wanted to make another Antichrist revealed video. I haven't done one of these in quite a while. If you want to watch the first 4 that I've made, I'll leave the link in the description section below. And we've gone through Daniel 11:37, John 5:43, Daniel 9:27, and the 7-year covenant, and the false prophet. And so this is sort of a continuation of that. I'm getting this information from Chris White's book, False Christ. Will the Antichrist claim to be the Jewish Messiah? And it's a good argument, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but I tend to agree with Chris in his assessment that the Antichrist will try to make it look like he is fulfilling all of the messianic prophecies, especially a lot of them in the Old Testament, regarding, all the stuff about conquering and the temple sacrifice and everything else. But this main one, the wars of Antichrist, I want to talk about for a few reasons. First off, the Antichrist is a man of war. We know this in Revelation 13, and I'll get to that later. He comes into power by conquering the surrounding nations of Israel. And this is what we're looking at, Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45. And subsequently, the abomination of desolation timeline fits really well with Daniel 12:1 as we go right into that next chapter. People become impressed with his conquering ability, and they say, Revelation 13:4, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him? Leading up to Daniel 11 verses 40 through 45, it states that the Antichrist war-making capabilities are empowered by his worship of the god of fortresses, which is probably in reference to Satan, Revelation 13 verses 2 and 4. Now, this is something that Chris White doesn't mention, and I know he doesn't have any kind of alien connection here, but in terms of the alien deception, this is a possible scenario because David Flynn in some of his work has suggested that God of Fortresses can allude to Mars, and there's a connection there. I'll leave a link in the description section where you can check that stuff out. It's not conclusive, but it's a potential there, and with all the Mars talk, it seems to fit the current climate of what's going on as part of the agenda for the alien deception. But moving on, Matthew 24, before the abomination of desolation, there are wars and rumors of wars. And that makes sense because the Antichrist wars would fit that bill leading up to the abomination of desolation event, which is halfway through the final week of the 7 years. And if all this stuff isn't making sense, if I say the 70th week, which means the last 7 years, some of this stuff you won't understand unless you sort of study Bible prophecy and, have looked into some of this stuff. But I encourage you to do that. We also have the first seal, Revelation 6, verses 1 and 2. The first seal describes the rider of the white horse who has a bow, but it never mentions an arrow. He comes out conquering and to conquer, another reference to this war capability of the Antichrist. And this is a big sign. Most people think that the Antichrist is simply going to be this one that's going to unite the world in peace. And I think there's maybe an element to that, but there's definitely a war that takes place leading up to the abomination of desolation. It's a big deal. This is a big sign that will help us identify the Antichrist. Now, verse 40, it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. Now, the king of the south is Egypt, and we know this because of an earlier reference to the king of the south being Egypt earlier in the chapter. The king of the north, traditionally, with a lot of teachings, says it's Russia. And of course, now, with the rise of Russia again in geopolitics, people might go back to that and think, oh, it fits the bill, the king of the north, Russia, Putin, all this stuff. But this was based, at the time when it first came out, was based largely on the geopolitics of the day. And of course, even today, you can say the same thing. King of the north, we can say, oh, Putin, look at him, look at Russia. But there's a paper that was written by Dr. Paul J. Tanner named Daniel's King of the North, Do We Owe Russia an Apology? And he states in that paper, quote, to be hermeneutically consistent, the king of the north ought to be interpreted in light of the meaning the phrase has had throughout the chapter. I would like to submit that the king of the north is a confederation of northern Arab nations that will attack the Antichrist and his forces in this military conflict centered in the Middle East. So the two areas here, the king of the south and the king of the north, are Egypt and a coalition of Arab nations. Now, this is really interesting. If you guys have seen the area by which ISIS is trying to take over, and I understand ISIS is a creation of the CIA and all that, okay, so don't comment on that because I already understand that part of it, okay? But in any case, the goal for ISIS is to create this coalition of Arab nations and to take over all these Arab nations. So that should be a pretty big indicator that potentially what we're looking at with ISIS and its conquering is the formation of the king of the north. And they're going to rush upon this Antichrist figure who will present himself as the Jewish Messiah with whirlwinds, chariots, horsemen, and many ships. And it's interesting to point out that the two nations that attack the Antichrist first are Egypt and the coalition of Arab nations, because those are traditionally the enemies of Israel throughout the Bible. So there's something there that is nothing new under the sun, so to speak. The thing is, though, the Antichrist is going to come into the countries and shall overflow and pass through. The Antichrist is pretty much going to annihilate these nations, okay? The enemies of Israel, think about that. The world might be in support of a guy if he suddenly defeats all the terrorist groups, right? All those radicals. I know a lot of people are against the Jews and against Israel right now, but let's say a leader from Israel suddenly with his military might takes out all these terrorist groups, and a group like ISIS, let's, for example, say, I'm not saying ISIS is that, but if it is, it would be a big deal. And on the flip side of this, and this is why this view is so important and it's so subtle of a deception here, a lot of Christians that are into Bible prophecy are also in support of Israel. Now, I support Israel in terms of I want the people of Israel to be saved. I don't really support Israel in a military or a political way. I just support the people there. I want people there to be saved. I want them to turn to Jesus, period, as I do with every other nation, every other people group. But in terms of a political alignment, I'm just apolitical in terms of that kind of stuff. I'm not a Democrat or Republican or anything like that. I think we can make a difference in local politics in a certain way. But in terms of the bigger picture, I just see the whole thing as a ruse, as I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to and realize as well. But there is a genuine fervor by the community of Christians, a lot of them who study Bible prophecy, that are full lock and step with Israel, with the nation of Israel, the political Israel, okay? And if that is the case, if the Antichrist does present himself as the Jewish Messiah or claims to be the Jewish Messiah or not, he may not even have to do that. If he just presents himself as a great military leader for Israel and he starts taking out all the surrounding nations of Israel, what's the church going to do? Aha, see, God has protected Israel, right? When really that protection of Israel is led by the Antichrist. Very subtle, very, very powerful deception. This is the point that Chris White pointed out in his book that I think is key and the reason why this deception to the church, remember the church are the people who I think Satan's going to really go after and try to deceive in the end times, because he's already got the world, right? So, just something to think about. I'm not saying this is exactly how it's going to play out, but it's very compelling, very, very compelling given the climate of the Bible prophecy community, if you will, especially in America, right? So just something to keep in mind here. Now, just to skip real quick to verses 42 through 44, this sort of helps to support verse 40, where it says, "He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction." And of course, remember, he is the son of destruction, the son of perdition. And so it's interesting here that the Antichrist will take over Egypt as well. And think about the resources of Egypt. You have, all the stuff from the pharaohs, the pyramids. And again, Chris White doesn't take it beyond the scriptures, but, I like to speculate and go reach out a little bit beyond that. And, I'm honest about that. I'm not saying that this is true, but you have Egypt, you have the pyramids, you have all these sort of esoteric and occult significances to that. Is it possible that perhaps, again, there is some sort of connection there to an alien deception, right? Not that aliens exist. Some people still confuse that when I say alien deception, but, part of its narrative can be, oh, we're going to, this guy has taken over all of these treasures and he's, revealing the truth about where we come from and all this stuff. And that'll make sense a little later too. But, the uncovering of ancient technology is something that all these alternative researchers and conspiracy theorists have been talking about for a long time. So it would appeal to that crowd, especially Christians who are really into that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I'm saying, it's a potential thing. But getting back to the whole point here, the Antichrist is going to try to make it look like he is fulfilling messianic prophecies of the messianic age. Isaiah 11:16, 19, and 27, verses 12 through 13, Micah 7:12, Zechariah 14:18 through 19. Go look at those scriptures And, this is what the Messiah will do as part of the Messianic age. And so what the Antichrist is trying to do is to make it look like he is fulfilling those prophecies. And this will be more apparent as we go to verse 41. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main parts of the Ammonites. And so people who read this passage usually suggest that the Antichrist defeats Egypt and the Arab nations, and then he's going to go attack the Jews. That's why, some people have suggested that the Antichrist is from Islam. And Chris White's done a whole thing with Islamic Antichrist Debunked, and I encourage you to check that out if you are in that camp that believes the Antichrist will be Islamic. Again, it's possible, but I think Chris White does a pretty good job of showing how it won't be, although Islamic eschatology will have a huge role in this end times unfolding. But a closer look at this passage here in verse 41 shows the exact opposite. The Antichrist will enter Israel to defeat all of its closely surrounding nations. If he's presenting himself as the Jewish Messiah, he needs to defeat all the enemies of Israel, right? For example, Palestine. That's a big one. And, it's a pretty big deal that we just saw the Palestinian flag go up in the UN. But that's, modern stuff. But in any case, the reason why it's important here that it says, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites, is because in the Messianic prophecies of Zephaniah 2, verses 4 and 9, it says how the real Messiah is going to take back all the land, including the micro-enemies of Israel. And it even mentions by name, Gaza, Ashdod, Ekron, and Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Okay, so those nations are included in where the real Messiah will take back Israel. But the Antichrist, while trying to make it look like he's fulfilling this prophecy, will fail at it. He's not going to be able to conquer Edom, Moab, and the Ammonites. And so if we understand this, this will be a major indicator that the Antichrist is really at hand, because he is going to fail at his attempt to fulfill this prophecy. Now, moving on here, verse 45, and he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him. Now, this is a very important passage to consider. Palatial tents, is this the temple? It's possible. It doesn't have to be. And yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Most people think that's the end of the Antichrist. Next chapter. But remember, there was no chapter break when this was written. Okay, so we are supposed to roll right into the next chapter without a break. So consider that when we go into Daniel 12, verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people will be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Okay, so this is a big deal. If you grasp sort of the timeline of the abomination of desolation, verse 45, as the last verse of chapter 11, says that, the Antichrist comes to his end. Yet, in verse 1 of chapter 12, at that time shall arise Michael. And there's a whole study that can be done to show that the restrainer that's talked about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 6, is the archangel Michael. And so right here, the reason why Daniel 12:1 says, at that time shall arise Michael, is because Michael leaves the protection over Israel and goes to fight Satan in heaven. And that's when Satan is cast down to earth, right? And that makes sense, because when Satan is cast down to earth, there you have it. You have the abomination of desolation event. And that's when the Antichrist will basically resurrect and stand in the holy place, calling himself God, all this stuff. It makes sense with the overall timeline. Now, that's in Revelation 13. It talks about the mortal head wound of one of the heads of the beast, but it was healed. So there you have it. That's the timeline. And it really does come together nicely if you look at this and you have sort of an idea of the timeline that I'm talking about here. And another proof text of this is that line where it says, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. You go to Matthew 24, verse 15. What does it talk about? So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then he goes into that whole thing about fleeing. And then in verse 21, it says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So this means the abomination of desolation event involves most likely the resurrection of the Antichrist. Okay, so this is another reason why Revelation 13 talks about the building of the image in honor of the first beast who had a mortal head wound yet lived. And this leads to why the dragon is worshipped. And, people say, who is like the beast, who can make war against it? So that's another thing that's really interesting here. Now, one of the things that is really important here to point out, and this is the last thing I'll point out for this video, is the connection to Jewish eschatology. And again, Chris White points this out in his book. He explains how many Jewish people are awaiting the exact description of the Antichrist as outlined here in Daniel 11, verse 40 through 45. There's a prophecy about Messiah ben Joseph, where he's going to destroy the enemies of Israel, march victoriously to Israel, where he is killed by his enemies, and then miraculously be resurrected, beginning the Messianic age, but not before killing those who will not submit to the new Messianic authority. What's that sound like? The genocide that will happen at the end, where the dragon will basically come after the saints, right? And that whole prophecy comes out of the Talmud. Now, this is according to the Jewish Encyclopedia. Quote, Messiah b. Joseph will appear prior to the coming of Messiah b. David. He will gather the children of Israel around him, march to Jerusalem, and there, after overcoming the hostile powers, reestablish the temple worship and set up his own dominion. Thereupon, Armilus, or Gog and Magog, will appear with their hosts before Jerusalem, wage war against Messiah b. Joseph, and slay him. His corpse will lie unburied in the streets of Jerusalem until Messiah b. David comes and resurrects him. Now, Messiah b. Joseph sounds like this Antichrist figure that's going to do all the wars. Who does Messiah b. David sound like, or Messiah ben David? It sounds exactly like the false prophet as outlined, the second beast that comes out of the earth that's described in Revelation 13. And so it's fascinating. It fits so well with the prophecies of what the Christians call the Antichrist and the false prophet, what the Jews are calling their Messiah, and how he comes in two parts, Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. It's just really fascinating. So that's all I have for you guys today. I know it's a little bit longer on this video, and it's a little bit, I guess, irrelevant to world events, so to speak, but I think there is a tie here. And the reason why I want to do this is because, number one, I think Chris did an amazing job of putting this together, and I think it deserves more attention. And number two, I want to put it out there more because I want to see what you guys think in terms of, challenging the position, okay? Because the only way we're going to really grow and understand, learn from each other is if we put stuff out there like this, and iron sharpens iron. This doesn't mean we break fellowship. It doesn't mean, we hate each other and that kind of stuff. None of that stuff is what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm throwing this out there because I think Chris White's research is really good. For me, I looked at it and said, that makes a lot of sense. And so that's why I want to represent it on here. And then, let's have a discussion. Let's look at how this might fit into the world events right now in so many ways. And, remember, this is coming straight out of the Word of God. So we are prepared and we know what to look for, so we don't fall for Obama's the Antichrist or the Pope is the Antichrist or, that sort of thinking. Now, they very well could be once they start doing some of the things that are described in the Bible, but until they do, we won't know. And that's really the point here. So, hope you guys have an awesome day. God bless.